We want to bring here on the show Kambale Musavuli to move to the African continent, where there's some also maybe similar sorts of misdirection plays going on about what's really happening. Kambale, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
No, the pleasure is all ours. And, you know, I think it was earlier this week, it might have been towards the end of last week, I'm getting my days confused. There was this conference, Italy hosts this conference, so-called security conference, to address ISIS in Africa. That's what they claim, to build a military infrastructure. Italy is talking about how they are going to perhaps fill some of the role that the French were playing, and they're trying to bring in different African countries, but whether we're talking about Mozambique, whether we're talking about Nigeria, whether we're talking about Congo, this issue of ISIS, ISIL, whatever they want to call them, seems to be getting raised quite consistently by the US and the European countries to really ramp up their military interventions there in the continent.
You have mentioned 3 countries that have one thing in common: oil. Right? Mozambique, Congo, and Nigeria. And in the context of the Congo, specifically around ISIS, is one of the most bizarre situations where the State Department and the Department of Defense of the United States so adamant in saying that there is ISIS in the DRC. I mean, for those who do not know much about the DRC and the Congo, Congo religiously is majority Christian. So we have a very small Muslim community. They are there. Even with that, the way to frame it, right, that we have these Islamic terrorists that never existed before, reminds us of what happened in Nigeria with Boko Haram. Now, we did not have this issue before having increased militarism. I mean, the real issue is, for the past 2 decades, there's been an increased militarism across the African continent. The presence of France in the Sahel, they work closely with the United States. That's what most people do not realize, that the United States they are the logistical partner to the French soldiers. So if the French soldiers need to get to Burkina Faso faster, they will use some of the US planes to fly them over. Now, specifically for the DRC, why it's very disturbing is, when in the early 2000s, the Heritage Foundation started talking about Africa, people did not pay attention about them, right? They wrote a so-called white paper speaking about the need for the United States to have a military command for 2 things, right? 1, control China. China has access to the continent. And 2nd, secure oil, because Africa started surpassing the Middle East for selling oil to the United States, particularly Angola, Nigeria, and so on. And of course, there are more oil deliveries. So this was just a white paper. Then in 2007, Donald Rumsfeld speaks to Bush and make it into a reality. And one of the most bizarre situations also happened. The creation of AFRICOM, the first commander of AFRICOM was an African American, Skip Ward, who actually went to an HBCU as well. So they had this blackface as the head of AFRICOM, going to African countries to ask for African countries to have the US headquarters of AFRICOM in their countries. Almost all the African countries they contacted at the time, they refused. Then you had Obama come in, which sanitized the image of AFRICOM. They were presenting it as a mission to train African soldiers, to provide security, to help in democracy exercise. For those of us who have seen rigged election, we know what democracy exercise looks like when you have military actually employing that. And I think in the United States, when we look at the movement for Black Lives, people know what the police does for keeping the order. So we saw how many oppressive regime received support with that. Now, fast forward now to the past 5 years in the DRC. There has been, at least for the past decade, a militia group called the ADF, Allied Democratic Forces. They have ties to Uganda. They've been operating in the Congo since the late 1990s. And surprisingly, they became this powerful force around 2006, 2007, when there was an oil discovery in DRC. We have a lake called Lake Albert, which has about 2.5 billion barrels of oil. That's a lot of oil in one lake, right? In that lake is at the Congolese border with Uganda. On the Ugandan side, we have a French company that has gotten some of the oil blocks, and the French company is Total, the French oil company. On the DRC side, the development has not unfolded. So whenever you look at the oil block, this is something anyone can actually do. You look at the different oil blocks in the lake, and you look at where the massacres are taking place. It's taking place closely to where the oil is actually found. These rebels are killing civilians. They are putting statements as they are connected to ISIS. They have these videos and so on. But most interestingly is that there have been a study, but the UN group of experts is a group of researchers who work with the UN Security Council to go find facts on the ground to bring to the Security Council. They have studied the situation with ADF multiple times, and the last time was just this past month, to actually find out, does the ADF have any connection with ISIS? They've already published 4 reports, and the last one was last month. And they are clear in stating that there is no connection whatsoever. They actually say whatsoever between ISIS and this rebel group. But then you go to the State Department and you look at the statement that the US State Department published. They actually have indexed the DRC as a country with foreign terrorists. That they have said that the DRC harbors an ISIS affiliate, which is also similar to what's happening in Mozambique, right? That they are these ISIS all of a sudden who are so powerful that they do not take over power of the country, right? They don't go and say we're going to change the government, anything. They just stay in one particular area and continue to massacre people. So I think the bias that I should mention is, my family is actually from the area where the massacres are taking place, in Beni particularly, right? So beyond the news, what the reporters will write, beyond what the UN group of experts will write, with direct communication with the people, they are very clear about why they are being killed. They are being displaced forcefully, they're being massacred, and there is no action whatsoever. With 22,000 UN peacekeeping forces, they are not able to stop less than 500 rebel groups. And the Congolese army is not able to do so. So we know this is propaganda. We've seen it in Iraq. We've seen it in Afghanistan. And we are seeing it on the African continent for 2 reasons. Counter China and get access to strategic minerals. And some of them are oil, cobalt, and so on.
I mean, it's sadly such a familiar story. I mean, it's hard not to think about the first scramble for Africa, where they were claiming they were addressing slavery, and that's why they had to go in. And now it's ISIS, it's terrorism. But when you look at all of this, I don't know if I'm being too predictive or whatever it may be, but it does seem that the only real through line here is that Africa is more likely to become a direct battleground for sort of US, European boots on the ground, in the same way the Middle East had become, at the turn of this century. I mean, it just feels like it's leading towards that. Maybe I'm being too pessimistic, but it's hard not to read it that way when we're seeing these countries like Italy and others talking about, well, we're going to increase our presence. Germany, the same thing. The United States sending the airborne troops to Somalia earlier this year, saying they're going to start doing more rotations onto the continent. I mean, it really does feel that we are looking at, not that interventions ever stopped, but a new era of really aggressive interventions.
And it's been actually happening for the past 2 decades. I remember a few years back, I think maybe 3 or 4 years, no, 2 years ago maybe, when the American soldiers were killed in Niger. and the U.S. media was discussing how Donald Trump was not respectful to the family, did not provide proper condolences. I mean, it was really strange to hear even what the media was discussing. I mean, and that's not what we were discussing. We were discussing why is a young black man from Chicago in Niger killed? Because one of the soldiers was African American from Chicago. Like, how did he end up there? So you had 4 American soldiers killed, but the discussion was that what is it that we are doing in Niger? I mean, are we providing democracy support? Are we providing some type of aid? But no, we have American soldiers, right? So we have drone bases in Niger. We have a strong military presence across West Africa, and particularly even in Ghana. In March of this year, in 2021, the US military had a military exercise in Accra. I mean, can you imagine the Ghanaian military having a military exercise in Washington, D.C. with American citizens looking around? And going back to the DRC, the DRC is a fascinating country. It's the 2nd largest African country by size, and it's the 4th largest by population. It's endowed with so many mineral resources. You cannot have a Tesla vehicle without Congo's cobalt. It's impossible. We know for a fact that every Tesla vehicle gets its cobalt from Glencore, and Glencore is a mining company getting cobalt from DRC.
Wow.
So whenever I'm looking at this guy, Elon Musk, tweet about Bitcoin, he could care less about the environment. He's not caring about the environment in DRC with the cobalt that they're getting. So the resources of the Congo, the cobalt, the zinc, the copper, the oil, the diamonds, this wealth is for the development of the Congo, of the African continent, but it's also the last frontier for new technology. So whoever controls Congo's resources now controls. They are building space the space stations in the world. They all want to go to Mars and so on. Congo's resources. So China has a different approach to Africa, right? China discusses with the Africans. They come and deal with the Africans and say, this is what we need, and there is a deal. The US is not taking that same approach. For the past century, the United States has taken the approach of supporting strongmen and middlemen who are oppressing the people. It started at the so-called Berlin Conference. In 1885, most people do not know that the United States was actually part of the carving up of the African continent. They actually were in these meetings. And the United States was the first country to recognize that the land what we call Congo becomes the personal property of the King of Belgium, King Leopold II. And since 1885 to present, the United States has continued to support that approach, where when we mobilize to have one of our leaders, a young Congolese, Patrice Lumumba, rise up in the 50s to be able to take the country to a different direction in 1960, within months, he was deposed. Within almost 6 months later, on January 17, 1961, he was assassinated with the help of the CIA. And then after, it's been that continuous process. So seeing the increased militarism on the African continent comes from the US, I guess, DNA to use military force to subdue either population, the leaders of different regions, to be able to serve US interests. But people are resisting. You know, it's the discussion I'm having with many of the young people on the African continent, everyone is clear. We must stop France engagement across the African continent. We must stop using the franc CFA, the currency from France. We must stop US militarism. We want to be able to determine our own affairs on the African continent, and particularly in the Congo.
I mean, as you know very well, this is so interesting to me because as you know very well, Kambale, at least in the United States, you know, Africa as a news topic is essentially an afterthought. But it seems from what you're saying, especially this issue of the role of China, the reality of growing resistance, that the outcome of this struggle is extraordinarily strategic for how the century is going to turn. That without the continued neo-colonial holding down of Africa, there's no way this imperial agenda can move forward either economically or politically, and possibly a sort of very new way of the world, turn for the world, could take place if countries are able to leverage a multipolar world and become more independent and produce a different sort of politics. I mean, it really does feel, maybe this is what I'm really getting at, that Africa is such a pivotal continent in terms of what the 21st century is really going to look like.
And it looks like we are back in 1960s, right? Because whenever I'm looking at that moment, there was a Cold War happening, and Africa was essential for that Cold War. And the US wanted to make sure that they control Africa's wealth. If you listen to, or you just watch Dwight Eisenhower's speech, he made a speech on January 17, 1961. The day his CIA was killing Lumumba, he made a speech about the military-industrial complex, right? But when you listen to that speech, he was really explaining US position around militarism. It wasn't that he was warning us around military-industrial complex. It was literally telling us that the military-industrial complex needs African resources. And at that time, it was cobalt, right? So Patrice Lumumba was eliminated. But at the same time, the movement wasn't in a silo. I mean, we had African youth mobilizing on the African continent. Then on the United States side, you also had people mobilizing, right? The civil rights movement wasn't just a civil rights movement. There was a global movement of the oppressed, be it in the United States and on the African continent, where people wanted to have a say in their future. And all the leaders who played a key role were strategically eliminated, either deposed, assassinated, and so on. And look at Malcolm X, a young man in Harlem who's saying, if you can understand what's happening in Mississippi and Alabama, you can understand what's happening in the Congo. Then he's assassinated. He was directly connected, not just with the people in the United States. He was communicating with people on the African continent. He visited Ghana. He went to Mecca. He met Africans. He was in direct connection with Africans, building a solidarity. And I just found out there was a young Angolan freedom fighter. She was writing letters to Dr. King as well, as he started becoming much more radicalized and understanding the importance of the oppressed, be it in Vietnam, on the African continent. He was also connecting with freedom fighters on the African continent. So all of that was happening in the 60s. Now, fast forward to now, the same thing is happening, right? In the United States, people are talking about 5G, right? They don't know that you can't have 5G if you don't have Congo's copper and Congo's cobalt, right? And then we had a very important movement, and I hope people were able to capture that because it also affected us on the African continent. The killing of George Floyd in the United States in the middle of a global pandemic showed the power of the oppressed. And that was, and that still is, we still have time. That's the opportune time to connect the struggles for people to understand that you are connected to the struggle of Africa. The exploitation that's happening to you in the Amazon factory can only happen if they can extract resources to make these robots that's telling you that it's time for you to go back to work after a 5 minutes time to pay. This is something I saw in a documentary, that you have these computers pretty much monitoring how Amazon employees are abused, right? Most people do not know that Amazon employees are abused on the African continent. But we know if they did not take our resources, they won't be able to make the technologies. Can we now, at this moment, create these alliances so that when we are fighting on the ground, because young Congolese right now, we just celebrated on June 30th, pretty much yesterday, the 61st anniversary of our independence. And across the Congo, everyone is clear. We achieve political independence, but we don't have economic independence, that we must continue to fight to take that control. So imagine us in the DRC, when the US ambassador, Mike Hammer, want to have a meeting with the civil society of the DRC and say that this is how you should engage in the election. And young Congolese are saying, until people who look like us are treated with human dignity, you have no right to have an embassy in this continent or in our country. That's the type of solidarity that we hope we can build. We understand the moment, but we must now actively work to make the links across the ocean so that all of us who are oppressed by the same system are able to resist and win this struggle.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly the global tide of resistance does seem to be rising. So it'll be interesting to continue to talk about this, continue to follow this. Kambale, thank you so much for being willing to give us some of your time here today on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Absolutely.